Well, my friends, 1 week gone, and who knows how many more days. But we want to continue with this class, make sure we get through here, um, and maybe even give you something to do. I find that it's sort of tense times in life. It's nice to have things be a little normal and just be able to, you know, get back to things that are familiar. And my incredibly dull and annoying voice droning on and on and on at you is certainly one of the things you've grown accustomed to these last few months. So, with that said, we have already looked at Congress, how bills are passed, how laws are passed, how a person becomes a congressperson, the powers of Congress. Now we're going to start looking at what Congress actually does, like why Congress people behave as they do, and also some possible obstacles and possible solutions to making Congress in the United States work better. And to be sure, although we are focusing largely on the United States in this class, certainly this applies to other parts of the world as well. One of the matters we have here is why do members of Congress vote like they do? Like a law or bill has been passed or has been proposed. It is a bill. What determines what your congressperson would do with that bill? And why don't you stop the video for just a second, put it on pause, and just in the back of your head, just think if you can think of what might affect how a particular congressperson, member of the House or member of the Senate, would do, why that person would vote like she would. And we have a whole collection of ideas. The constituents, i.e., the people they represent. There are certain things, if you're elected by a population and they expect you to do something, you do that. There's also the party itself, that there is a lot of pressure, and that's increasingly true in recent years, that if Republican President Trump has supported a bill, you as a Republican are very much expected to vote for it, even if you might have some private reservations. So you vote like your party does. Certainly, again, the president's influence is major. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt referred to the presidency as a bully pulpit. Well, I can't pass the laws, but I can say what I support, and I expect my people in Congress to go through. Personal ideology. This is tricky. Does the congressperson vote his conscience? Well, this is what I believe is right. Or maybe sometimes she doesn't personally agree with something, but the party is in favor of it. Or here's a good question. Are there times in which you should vote for something that you think is a bad idea because the people who elected you want and expect you to do it? And that's a big question. Somebody in Congress, any politician, is it their own beliefs and values that they should be focusing on and putting first, or what they believe the people they represent want? And that's not an obvious question, to be sure. There are also interest groups, and we'll barely touch on this, but this is so powerful. Lobbyists are people who have full time jobs trying to get representatives to vote in certain ways. And often these are big corporations, they're people with the bigger money. Look, if an organization that could possibly fund your next reelection campaign to the tune of thousands, tens of thousands, in some cases, as we'll see, even millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars, could that possibly lead you to vote in a certain direction? Also, these interest groups also can provide information. Look, most Congress people do not read all details of all laws they're voting on. But if there is a group, let's say the Sierra Club, a major environmental protection group, were to strongly support House Bill 371, well, if the Sierra Club has supported it and you are an environmentally inclined congressperson, you might vote for it for that reason. And again, most senators, most congresspeople don't read the bills they're debating. They're too long. Some have argued a little lazy sometimes, but the people they hire do read them. Hey, you're fresh out of college with a master's degree from Brown University. Read this bill. Take notes. I want a 2-minute summary tomorrow. And so, of course, how the staffers present the information can play a real role as well. And of course, the media. Absolutely. There are things in which Congress people are thinking, I would support this law. Ooh, I don't like how this would be how this would be spun in the media. A classic example, sort of this, and some other things as well. John Kerry in 2003 was privately very opposed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and he was going to vote against the authorization to send U.S. troops into Iraq. However, some of his staffers, you'll see above, said, look, the media is going to make this look like you're weak on national defense. Mr. Kerry, you're planning to run for president next year. I don't think you can afford to vote no. And Kerry said, well, but I think I can explain that I think this would make America less safe. And the people around him, his advisors, said, look, you're going to get 30 seconds in the media, and they're simply going to say, voted against taking military action against Saddam Hussein. As a potential president, I don't think you can afford that. So therefore, he voted in favor of authorization of military action in Iraq, which has not turned out all that well. So it's any combination of all of these, really. Who wins elections? Well, you know what? It's usually going to be the incumbent. The incumbent is the person that is holding power and running for re-election. It's usually about 90% in the House of Representatives and a little bit less than that, more varying in the Senate. Redistricting, which is pretty important, we'll come back to this. Every 10 years, a new census is taken. It could be that New York has 27 House members this year. Maybe it'll be 28 next year, or maybe it'll be 26. Well, they have to redraw the lines. Who redraw those lines? Often they are withdrawn within the candidate in power. If the Democrats run New York and they have some Congress people they particularly like, they may specifically draw the lines in a way that that person will be reelected. Name recognition matters. You know, the devil you know as opposed to the devil you don't know. We know this from psychology, those who have taken AP psychology, the mere exposure effect. All things equal, if you keep seeing a name over and over again and you're familiar with it, there's comfort level to that. Also, the perks of office, that basically means the fact that you're in office, you get free email. You have reason to communicate directly. For example, using the mails, using email. You need to send up policy advice. You need to send out announcements to your people. Well, in a way, that's kind of free advertising, and that's a real help. Also, casework. You might hear somebody say, this is wrong. I'm taking it to my congressperson. Well, sometimes members of Congress can get directly involved in individual struggles that people or groups are having. And pork barreling, you might recall. Strange phrase, but can you recall what that means? It's basically writing and supporting legislation that helps your home district. In other words, if you are the member, let's say representatives from Alabama's 5th district, and you are able to get a law passed that set up a federal job creation program that affects your district, you'll be able to say, look what I've done for my constituents. Look what I've done for the people voting for me. And of course, there's an advantage. It's not to say that they're not being sincere about this. It's not to say that it's a big scam necessarily, but it's not that uncommon as elections approach that the people who are voting suddenly get things that they kind of want, which makes the incumbent candidate look stronger. You certainly see that everywhere. Incumbents did really well in 2018. There were 376 House incumbents, so there are about 60 seats where there was no incumbent person running, and 92% were reelected. By the way, all 29 incumbents who stood for reelection and lost, they were all Republicans. 2018 was a blue wave. The Democrats lost very, very few seats and overall gained, I think it was close to 50 seats out of the 435. The average margin of victory in these House races is about 30%. Honestly, if there are 435 House seats up for election in any term, there might be 30, there might be 50, in a very unusual case, 60, 70, or 80 seats that potentially there's question about who's going to win, but for the most part, these districts are drawn in ways that there's not much competition. Many argue that's a problem. Senators, 28 ran for re-election, 5 were unsuccessful. 4 were Democrats, 1 Republican. Now, it was a blue wave, but these Democratic seats were held in very, very Republican places. But even here, you're still seeing better than 80% of incumbents win again. And again, all the advantages you saw on the last screen add to this. And most of them aren't close. A handful of Senate elections were very, very close. Most were, well, 20, 30, 40 points sometimes. On average, about 17. And again, you can look at this for a moment, but generally speaking, it wasn't just 2018. Generally speaking, incumbents win usually anywhere between about 85 and close to 100% of the time in the House, a little bit less in the Senate, and partly that's because you represent an entire state. So therefore, it's harder to focus on a small district to keep your own people happy. But even if you look at 1980, where only about half of the incumbents won, that's an aberration, and it's generally in the 80 to 90% range. In fact, almost always is. So if you are an incumbent and you're running again, you're probably gonna win. But sometimes incumbents do lose. You might stop the film for a second and think, wait, what would cause an already elected member of the House or Senate to lose this time? Well, did you come up with any of these ideas? Number one, the challenger could have a lot of money, either her own personal money or groups standing behind her, that allow them to buy more media, that allow them to basically get the name out there. Secondly, it could be that there is a really good challenger, somebody who's very popular, somebody who is very well known. This is going to sound kind of crazy. Many of you may have heard that Oprah Winfrey, who many of you know as an actor and also as the host of a famous TV show, there was some talk about her running for president. There have been others that said, you know what she should do? She should run as a Democrat for the Senate in Mississippi, because although Democrats could never win a Senate election in Mississippi, wow, she's really well known. She's very popular. She might motivate people to come out to vote. That's not happening, but that might be an example. Thirdly, if there's a scandal, it used to be said, this is a little bit crude, but it was once said of a senator, this guy could get elected unless they find him in bed with a live boy or a dead girl, suggesting that same-sex scandal relationship would be that much worse. But yeah, the idea that there is a sex scandal, there is a corruption scandal, there is something that leads people to doubt this, to doubt that that candidate deserves to hold on to her or his position. If you are running in a presidential election, for Senate or Congress or House of Representatives, if there is also a presidential election, we call this the coattails. What it would mean is if you are running with a candidate who is winning 65% of the vote across the country, that will tend to increase your vote. However, if you are an incumbent running alongside a very, very unpopular or weak presidential candidate, that could cause you to lose as well. Now, in 2018, there was no presidential election, but Donald Trump has consistently had very low approval ratings. Usually around 40% of the American population approves. The fact that overall Republicans did very, very poorly, including 29 incumbent Republican House of Representative members losing, had a lot to do with the fact that people were voting against Trumpism, against Donald Trump. But again, incumbents usually win. There have been some concerns. We talk about a monopoly on government. The idea that there are so few ideas out there, that it's so hard to get rid of incumbents, that once they're in, they're there. And even when you change an individual, well, this guy has left power, so he's replaced by this woman. But it's all the special interest groups with all of their money. And there's no real choice in the United States because, you vote only the candidate with the most votes gets anything. So you can never dare to vote for a third or fourth party candidate. Um, Also, real questions too about how we draw our congressional districts. That gets a little bit complicated, but we'll look at it in a minute. Well, here are some basic ideas, and this is one you're probably pretty familiar with here in Bolivia. Term limits. You know that in the United States president is limited to 2 terms in office. There is no limitation for the House of Representatives or Senate. Some have argued that there should be, that you get new blood in. Others at the same time would argue, well, wait a minute. If you have somebody who's been a brain surgeon for 8 years, you don't take that position and give it to someone else to give someone else a try. In other words, professional politicians, and many of them are very decent, very capable people, there is an expertise. You come into power for, let's say you win a Senate election, you might spend the first 4 or 5 years really figuring out how to do your job effectively. And if there was a one-term limit, well, let's move on to someone else. So there are good arguments in both cases, but a lot of people really are concerned that you see the same people representing the same district for decade after decade after decade, and they just kind of lose touch with the people they represent. Campaign finance reform. We'll take a look at this in a little bit more detail, but how much money should organizations or individuals be able to spend, or should there be a limit on campaigns? Also, what we call redistricting, and again, we'll explain this a little bit more. Gerrymandering is a very specific and typically American term. It will be explained. The Supreme Court has not been very friendly to nonpartisan redistricting, but that'll be explained in a moment. And something that was suggested in the UK that is now tried in one state, ranked choice voting, will be explained. By the way, on these last three, I am sending you in the email a quick video. Well, actually, one of them is not. Campaign finance reform and ranked choice voting, both explained in about 5 minutes. The idea of gerrymandering and what to do about that is a John Oliver clip that is significantly longer. Of course, done by a comedian, so perhaps more entertaining, but is a little bit longer. So with campaign finance, now, by federal election law, an individual can only donate, and I believe it's $5,400 now to an individual candidate. If I decide that I want to support Elizabeth Warren for president, I could send her in the primaries $5,400 of my money. If she gets the Democratic nomination, I personally could send her $5,400 more in her election bid in November of 2020. You can give to multiple candidates. I might decide that I like Elizabeth Warren, but I really love Bernie Sanders, and I could, I like Cory Booker as well. Well, I could send them all the maximum individually, or send a smaller amount to the candidates that I support less. Congress passed, and I believe this was in 2004, they passed a law to limit contributions not to individual candidates, that was already there, but to political issues, to overall election spending. In other words, it used to be to a degree that what you could do is, well, I'm sending $5,000 to Bernie Sanders. However, I could also donate money to an organization working against, let's say, Joe Biden, or in the general election against Donald Trump. Well, there was a case, a group called Citizens United, largely made up of corporations, of big companies, and they argued that this law was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court in 2004, and there's that 5-4 vote, so many Supreme Court votes are 5-4, said that there should be no restrictions. In effect, what they argue is that if you are a large corporation, you are the Mobile Exxon Corporation, you are Microsoft, or you are Google or Facebook or Amazon, you have the same First Amendment rights that the individual people do. In other words, as an individual, I can spend $20 million of my own money, if I have it, which I don't, to set up an organization that publicizes bad information about, say, Donald Trump. Well, corporations are allowed to do this as well. The result of this Supreme Court decision, and you see my language here, opened up the floodgates for massive spending. There were a couple of brothers from Kansas. One recently died, but the Koch brothers, they raised in the single election cycle 2016 over or close to $1 billion for various conservative causes. Now, a little bit of the money was $5,000 to this candidate, $5,000 to that. But the vast majority were about issues, and in particular, the Koch brothers, who are energy, that's where they got most of their money, is from fossil fuel energy. It's raising money to stop environmental awareness or environmental campaigns, would advertise, let's say, congressperson in West Virginia who had voted against increasing spending on coal extraction. Well, what they might do is perhaps donate $300,000 to an organization that publicizes what that sitting congressperson did. It's not strictly money going to the other campaign, but it's money that will hurt one. Sheldon Adelson, a very conservative Republican, had personally donated $100 million. And on the other end, Michael Bloomberg has been said he will be spending up to $80 million of his own money for supporting more liberal causes. Again, not necessarily directly the candidates, the more liberal Democratic candidates, but ways to get information out that will help them. A lot of people see this as a huge problem. I could be working at $11 an hour, decide that I really, really believe in a certain candidate, and it's not easy to do, but I'm going to donate $50 to her campaign because I believe in her. Well, what does this mean if somebody else could throw $5 million, $50 million in the other direction? How to change it? Honestly, what you would need is either a change in the court that would vote a different way, or, and this is being proposed, a constitutional amendment that would put specific limits on money sent to outside causes, and particularly from big corporations as opposed to individuals. There is a campaign finance video about the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission's court case, and that lasts about 5 minutes, and please have a look at that afterwards. By the way, when it comes to spending, this is my little, stop for a moment, look this over, and tell me what you're seeing here. I'm quite proud of this. This is actually my doing. I figured out how to do the graphics on it. But what you're seeing down here are 10,000 dots, exactly 10,000 dots. And each one represents a person in the bottom 99.99% of the United States in terms of wealth. So if you have 10,000 people in a room, 9,999 are here. And then there is one dot over here. This is the wealthiest person of those 10,000. According to 2012, and I don't think this has changed since then, about 60% of all campaign spending was created by 99.99% of the population. However, the top 0.1%, this single dot, spent about 40% on all elections. In other words, 330 million people spent about 60% of electoral money. 33,000 spent about 40%. So this one dot gets about as much political spending power, about 2/3 as much political spending power as these 9,999 dots. And again, you might think that there are some problems, that this one individual can nearly match the spending and contributing power and the influence that buys, the access it buys. If you've just donated $50,000 to a campaign in some way, do you think that candidate will pick up the phone when you call? You'd better believe it. When one of these dots calls, you have reached the office of, please leave him. Oh, sorry, the message box is full. Go away. This person will always get his or her calls answered. Redistricting. Now, this is very tricky. I think John Oliver, if you can stand the salty language, will really help you with this. But here's the idea. Every 10 years, there's a new census. We add up the population of the United States, and what we need to do is reapportion. In other words, right now, Alabama has 9 House of Representative members. Maybe Alabama has a smaller percentage of the population in the United States this year. They will lose 1 House member, and the lines have to be redrawn. So it's done every 10 years. In most states, I believe in 3/4 of the states, it's the state legislatures that do this. In other words, if the Republicans are in control of the state legislatures in Texas, they determine how these lines will be drawn. If the Democrats control, say, New York, and there is a new redistricting with the lines being withdrawn, Well, the Democrats would control that. Many argue, and I strongly agree, this should not be up to individual political parties deciding what's best for them. John Oliver, again, does a good job with that. There are some guidelines. Congressional districts can't deviate by more than 1%, meaning if, hypothetically, there are 20 million people in a state and it's divided into 20 districts, they all have to be roughly 1 million people each. Again, you can have a variance of 1%, but what you can't do, and this was true for many, many years, you can't have 5 people living in one congressional district, 30 million living in another, and 7 living in another. State legislatures can only deviate by a little bit more. So you can have a 10 plus or minus 10% population in any state legislature district. Why is this? Well, it comes back to the Supreme Court, and this time from 1962. The case was called Baker v. Carr. By the way, anytime you see a V with a period, it is a court case. And in this class, we're probably looking at Supreme Court cases. Here's the case. Tennessee state legislature had some districts with huge populations and other small ones. About 2/3 of the legislature were elected by 1/3 of the population. And people in Tennessee said, wait a minute, that's not fair. We believe that the 14th Amendment, which gives us equal protection, and remember, the right to choose your representatives is a way to protect yourself. These state legislative districts should be more equal. And the court said, you're right. The districts need to be of similar size. Again, within a state legislature, all districts must be within 10%. When it comes to congressional districts, i.e. New Jersey has, let's say, 13 House of Representative members, they all have very close to exactly the same number of people in each district. Well, where's the controversy? Here's the controversy. How do you draw these lines? How do you draw them? So, okay, we understand each House district in a state must have roughly the same population. But who goes into which district? There is a term called gerrymandering. John Oliver, again, explains it well, and I'll show you a map in a second that explains why it's called that. But it's a practice of drawing district lines, congressional district lines, to clearly advantage one group more than the other. It can be done, so far the Supreme Court has ruled, for political reasons. In other words, if it's a Republican legislature in Texas, could they draw the lines to put most of the Democrats in just a few districts and then have a small majority of Republicans in many others, which would lead to far more Republicans being elected? So far, the Supreme Court has said, yes, that is constitutional, or more accurately, they said, we're not going to interfere with this. It can also be done for racial reasons. Now, one thing that used to be done to limit the power of some racial minorities, and there are states, and this is particularly true in the days before the Civil Rights Movement, if African Americans were allowed to vote at all, their power was so spread out among districts that you would just simply never ever see an African American elected. Now, that is not constitutional. However, it is very, very hard to prove. We'll take a look at North Carolina in a few minutes, where it's very clear that the state was divided up by racial profiling, to be sure, but actually getting proof of that and getting the courts to act is hard. Another way that racial gerrymandering happened, and most argue that there's some good to this. If hypothetically a third of your state is Hispanic or African American, well, what you could end up happening, because if the lines are drawn in a certain way, you could get, let's say, the Hispanic population is just simply filtered throughout the state, divided up. You might have 20 legislature members, yet only one Hispanic representative. Well, this is considered constitutional and most people support it. The idea that if you have a neighborhood or a downtown district or a city that is, let's say, 65% African American, you do want to keep those voters together to be able to elect somebody from their community. It's not that black people don't vote for whites or whites don't vote for Hispanics or anything, but I think we would probably understand that if 13% of the population of the United States is African American and 17% is Hispanic, but if, let's say, Congress were 98% white, it would be hard to argue that people from certain minority groups are being well represented. Now let's take a look at what gerrymandering actually looks like. This is the original. Now this is going all the way back to like the early 1800s. This is the state of Massachusetts, and there was a congressional district that was carved that looked very, very, very unusual like this. The governor at the time was named Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry as we say gerrymandering, but close enough, Elbridge Gerry. And somebody at the time said, my God, it's like he's drawn a giant salamander here to protect his political interest. And somebody said, oh, that's not a salamander, that's a gerrymander. Well, not a particularly good joke, but gerrymandering is what we call dividing up House districts in a way, or elective representative districts in a way that clearly benefits one group over another. This is, for example, the North Carolina 12th District. This is a huge state. We are probably talking, about 300 miles from Durham to Charlotte, yet it's drawn in such an unusual way with these long, thin corridors cutting through cities, going around cities, that clearly was done to set up an advantage for one party after another. I believe what happened here is that this took a huge number of Democratic African American voters and made sure that they were all within this one district. So, congratulations, Democrats. You have won the 12th District House seat with 94% of the vote. However, because we're divided up in this way, you're not going to have Democratic voters in a lot of other closer districts. North Carolina has 13 House seats altogether. It is a split state. In the total election, you take those 13 districts together, 50% voted for a Republican candidate, 48% for a Democrat. Now, you and I would look at this and say, you should probably have 7 House districts that are Republican and 6 Democratic. That reflects the will. In fact, Republicans have won 10 of those 13 seats. And that's largely because a Republican state legislature had divided things this way. Although Republicans have very carefully said this has nothing to do with racial gerrymandering, all kinds of documents have come out to make it very, very clear that the Republican state legislature was very aware of where African American voters were living. African Americans tend to support Democrats. A lower court said you have to throw out this entire map. It's obviously based on race. An appeals court said, well, we're not so sure about that. But it does seem like the evidence that's come out very clearly this is based not just on political party benefits, but also minimizing the power of the African American vote. Here's the Louisiana 4th District. Now, Louisiana 1st kind of makes sense, and the Louisiana 7th kind of makes sense, and yeah, it makes sense. This is the 5th District, but look at the 4th District that goes from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state, that goes from the far west of the state to almost the far east of the state. And again, real questioning here about why these lines were drawn. And again, the answer comes down to we want to take the people in one particular, let's say, political party who are going to vote Democratic and combine them through creative drawing of lines on maps, which is, by the way, so easy to do with a computer now. You think about that. That all the people, 85, 90% of the voters in District 4 are going to be Democrats. And they will elect a Democrat, but it will leave Republicans with a majority in all other districts. By the way, if Democrats were in charge of more states, they would do this too, because they have done this too. So this is not, in my mind, a Republicans bad, Democrats good issue. How to gerrymander. And again, you see a pretty good job. John Oliver does get a little vulgar at this moment. Packing and cracking. Packing, excessively taking an opposing group and putting them in one or two districts, drawing the lines so that 88% of a state's African American population is all within one or maybe two districts. So packing them in. Or politically, making sure that Democrats have a major majority in one or two districts, but have relatively little power in the others. And then the opposite of that is cracking, in which you're taking an opposing group and say putting, 44% in this district and 41% in that district and 46% in this district. So cracking them into smaller proportions where, all things equal, they will probably lose the elections in the future. Here's an imaginary city. Call it Zegerville if you want. 150,000 residents. 90,000 are registered Republicans. 60,000 are registered Democrats. And there are 5 legislative seats. Now, how many should be Republican held? How many Democratic? Because there are 3 Republicans for every 2 Democrats, we would expect to see 3 Republican legislators and 2 Democratic. However, if 25,000 of the Democrats are packed into one district, suddenly you could have the Republicans winning 4 other districts, because the remaining 35,000 votes, well, that would mean the Democrats would typically win about 10,000 in each other district, and Republicans would end up winning 4 of the seats. And again, you can find Democrats doing this the same way, although we are at a point right now in the United States where Republicans have a lot more power, a lot more governors at the state level, and a lot more control over the state legislatures. But that could change, and if it does, I would expect the Democrats to play the same type of game. Unless laws are passed, constitutional amendments are added, which makes that illegal. So American representation, and it's not necessarily like this around the world, but a few things that you need to know about how the American electoral system, and here again, we're talking about the legislatures, the national legislators, the House and the Senate. Number 1, the House, single member districts. Now what that means is you're not voting for a political party, but you are voting for an individual. I am voting for Garcia, the Democrat, over Smith, the Republican. And within those single-member districts, there are 435 congressional seats. Each congressperson represents his or her own district. And within these districts, the winner takes all. Meaning, if you get 93% of the vote, you win. If you get 50.0003% of the vote, you win. If you get 8% of the vote, you lose. You get nothing. If you get 49.997% of the vote, you lose. You get nothing. There are advantages to this and disadvantages, but it certainly means a few votes here and there can make a huge difference. And since all 435 House districts are like this, that's fairly. The single-member districts, we've already mentioned this, 435 members, 435 distinct different districts. And again, not typical of the rest of the world. Many countries have parliamentary systems where overall, if your party wins 35% of the vote, well, you would get something like a third of the parliamentary representatives. So it's a different way of doing it. I believe what happens in Mexico, if there are like 100 seats, each party has a list of their candidates running, starting from number 1 down to number 100. If the PAN party were to win 37%, their first 37 candidates on their list go into the Congress. And then the same is done with the other parties. The UK works a little bit like this. It's not quite The Labor Party gets 28%, so they get 28% of the parliament. It's not quite like that, but it's a little closer to that, where they call this proportional representation. In other words, if you lose but don't lose badly, you're not completely shut out. And then the winner takes all system we've described. And again, once more, you see a system like this. Candidate A wins 30%, 25, 20, 15, 10. The winner is candidate A, even though candidate A only won 30% of the vote. Now, this would lead you to think, let's say this is the Democrat, candidate B is the Republican. These are third-party candidates, candidates that are not expected to win. They don't have a national presence. What you're tempted to do is say, wow, I really like candidate D. That's the Green Party candidate. And, oh, this is a working people's candidate. I love these two, but you know what? They're not going to win. I think I'm going to need to vote for the Democratic Party candidate. I don't like her very much. There's a corruption scandal. I disagree with her a lot. I'm really embarrassed by the Democratic Party these days, but I guess it's the lesser of two evils. The winner-take-all system promotes that. It's two major parties, and with rare exceptions, you can find individual elections, usually at local level, sometimes state, occasionally at the national level, but not often, where a particular third-party candidate really does gain traction and occasionally wins. But normally that's not going to happen. In fact, I think you saw this a little bit last week in Bolivia. Oscar Ortiz was thought to have maybe 10 or 12% of the vote. Well, it became fairly clear he was not going to win, and those who opposed Evo Morales said, you know what, I'm not voting for Oscar Ortiz. I'm going to vote for Carlos Mesa instead, because I think he can come within 10% of Evo Morales. And Oscar Ortiz, I believe, only got about less than 4% of the vote. And then finally, and there is a short video on this, Maine and the ranked choice. Myself, I love this. Rather than coming in and voting for a candidate, candidate C, what you do is you would rank them. You might say, look, my dream candidate is candidate D. And you know what? I would be okay with candidate E. And candidate C, I don't feel much about. Candidate A, I don't like that much, but my God, she's better than candidate B. Well, what you would do is order them. You would say, my preference is candidate D, followed by E, followed by C, followed by A, followed by B. Well, perhaps what would happen then, they would look at the results and say, I'm sorry, candidate E has finished last. Let's take candidate E's votes. And if anybody, whoever these people voted for second, get the votes. And the next vote is candidate A, 31%, candidate B, 29%, candidate D, 20%, candidate C, 21%. Candidate D is still in fourth place. We're going to take all the people that voted for E and D and give them their third choice. And then we might have candidate E, 39%, candidate B, 36%, candidate C, 24%. Candidate C has finished third. We now divide people's fourth choices between candidate A and candidate B. And the final result might be candidate A, 48%, candidate B, 52%. And the idea would be that, like in life, we don't necessarily have a yes or no. We could say, look, I like Oscar Ortiz. He's my candidate. However, if he doesn't win, I want Carlos Mesa to win. And I really don't want to see Evo Morales reelected. And that sounds like I'd be speaking for most of you in this class. This would give you permission to vote for Oscar Ortiz or vote for Hugo Cardenas or whoever else was running, knowing that it wouldn't be a wasted vote. Because if Oscar Ortiz did not finish in the top two, which he did not, his votes would go to the next preferred candidate. This is something that has been experimented with and actually is now being used in Maine and only in Maine. I've included a video for you to look at that explains this a little bit better. And in fact, it made the difference. The Republican had the lead. There were 4 candidates running, and 2 third and fourth party candidates collectively had about 8 or 9% of the vote. The Republican got more first place votes than the Democrat, but once they took the votes from the third and fourth place candidates and divide them based on ranked choice, the Democrat had about a 3,000 vote victory. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Personally, I would love it. It would allow more ideas in the political arena. You could support maybe an idea or a candidate that right now isn't that popular, but you want to support the idea, you want to support that candidate, but ultimately you're not working against what you consider to be a decent choice as opposed to an awful choice. Now, who doesn't like this? The political parties, the Democrats and Republicans. Why? Because it allows people to vote for more options as opposed to just their 2 parties. But seems to me a reasonable thing. Right, I think this takes us through about 45 minutes. I was estimating 40, so I didn't do too badly on this. Again, I would ask you to email me the notes that you took. You can Google Doc share or email, doesn't matter. If you took them by hand, then just click, quick phone photo and send those on to me, etc. I would assume you'd have a couple of pages of notes on this. I don't know. I don't particularly, but it's really kind of a completion grade. We will not be going over any of this in class, though. So for the test, whenever that happens, you'd want to be ready. This is how you're getting the information for sure. Remember, there are 3 videos also. One of them, again, has somewhat salty language, so if you're not comfortable with that, don't watch the John Oliver one, but it is genuinely both entertaining and informative, and the other 2 are more straightforward, just kind of, here's what you need to know about political campaign finance reform and what you need to know about the ranked choice. All right, hope to see you all soon. Hope people are doing well, and as always, be in touch if you have any questions.